Hey, it's Jess, and welcome to Becoming Heartstrong. I'm a social entrepreneur, speaker, mother, and business owner, and I'm here because I believe in you, and I want you to live your full potential. My mission with this podcast is simple: to offer you perspectives, tools, and inspiration to help you live with more courage, rebuild after setbacks, and strengthen yourself from the inside out. So each week, I talk to thought leaders, authors, experts, and everyday amazing people who share their stories and outlooks that help you get from where you are today to where you want to be tomorrow. Let's get started. Do you ever feel like you have something great inside of you, but you just aren't sure how to bring it to life? Do you ever need some clarity on how to get from where you are to where you want to be? I'm so excited to share a free guide I created just for you. This tool has helped me in my own times of struggle and doubt. It's called Your Future Self Guide. This mini course includes a future self visualization I recorded, a series of journal questions, and some insights from me about overcoming self-doubt and embracing self-leadership. You can download it for free at jessicalindberg.com/futureself. That's jessicalindberg.com/futureself. Let's get back to the show. Hey everyone, welcome to Becoming Heartstrong. I'm so glad that you're here today. My guest today is Dr. Ben Baran. Ben is an organizational psychologist and an award-winning management professor at Cleveland State University. He's also the co-founder of the firm Indigo Anchor and also the host of the Indigo podcast. He's a captain in the U.S. Navy Reserve. And today we're going to talk about adversity and leadership and how our personal challenges integrate into our lives. He's the author of 25 publications on leadership, management, and adversity. And his military service has taken him all the way from the coast of California to Afghanistan. So Ben, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks so much, Jess. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah. So, you talk and write about adversity, how organizations deal with adversity, how we deal with it as individuals. And I'm just wondering, as we get started, if you can just tell us where that curiosity comes from that you have.
Sure. So first of all, given that you mentioned my military affiliation, I do want to just say that any views I present here are mine and do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Department of Defense or its components, including the U.S. Navy. With that being said, I have been, as you mentioned, very interested in this whole idea of adversity, how we as humans, as individuals, as groups, as organizations deal with it. And I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. But I do know that it's been an interest of mine for a very long time. I joined the military straight out of college. I was part of Navy ROTC, so they paid for my college, and I was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Navy in 2002. And right away on active duty in the military, got to experience the frustrations as well as the wonder of how large organizations work. And I think those early experiences really gave me even more of an appetite for figuring out what it is that helps organizations of any size navigate uncertainty, navigate ambiguity, and can persist even when we have really tough things that we're dealing with, and with the complexity of just being full of humans. And we humans are interesting creatures indeed. So I don't know exactly where the interest exactly came from. It could be something that I'm a little bit hardwired with. It could just be aspects of how I grew up. I'm just very curious in that. And I have, like you said, always found it to be something fascinating. And it's also just a topic that is of perpetual interest and use for all of us. Because if there's anything certain in life, well, first of all, death and taxes are, as Benjamin Franklin likes to remind us, are certainly part of life, but so is adversity, so is suffering, and all of those different things that come together to really make life challenging, but at the same time provide amazing different ways in which we experience just the adventure of life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that these topics that you're right about are so timely. I mean, they're always timely, I think, as humans, but especially now, I think people are facing a lot of different challenges. Our world is a challenging place because, as you noted, it's full of humans. You write about something that you call crucibles, and would you share with us how you define that, and you know how those integrate into the idea of being a leader or being a human being?
Sure. So, how I define a crucible experience is quite simply those experiences that we have in life that are unexpectedly hard and have the potential to transform us.
Mm.
It's self-evident to me that what does not kill us does not necessarily make us stronger. I can come up with many examples, as I'm sure you can, of people who have faced tremendous adversity and it hasn't made them stronger. But we do have the possibility in our struggles, in our suffering, in our crucibles to transform our lives and the lives of others in positive ways. So that's how I define crucibles, and they're important because they're unavoidable. Most of them. We have unexpected things that happen to us. Certainly, you are no stranger to that. With the death of your son, Ethan, with the struggles that you've had beyond that, dealing with that grief, and I assume with all of the challenges of dealing with a special needs kiddo with Bodhi. And certainly, my experiences are similar in certain ways to what you have gone through and continue to deal with.
So, in thinking about crucibles and talking about how they bring out the best of us in humans, which I absolutely agree, and that's definitely true in my life, would you say that they're gifts?
The first thing I think about when you ask that question is I'm wondering if you've ever seen the interview between Stephen Colbert and Anderson Cooper,
I have.
where they talk about this.
Yes.
Yeah. So for your listeners who maybe haven't, there's this really phenomenal interview where Stephen Colbert is talking with Anderson Cooper, and Anderson Cooper has recently lost his mother, and he's talking to Stephen Colbert, who had reached out to him after that had happened, about grief and so forth. And Stephen Colbert, your listeners may not be aware, he experienced a devastating loss when he was 10 years old. His father and two of his older brothers, he's the youngest of 11. His father and two of his older brothers died in a plane crash when he was 10 years old. And Anderson Cooper asks him a little bit about that. And one thing that Stephen Colbert says, he says, "What punishments of God are not gifts?" And then Anderson Cooper says, "Do you really mean that?" And he says, "Yes, I do." He said, if we're going to be thankful for existence at all, we have to be thankful for all of it. And coincidentally, I was looking into the origin of that quote, and it turns out Colbert was actually paraphrasing. He wasn't directly quoting J.R.R. Tolkien, who also had a tremendously difficult life and also produced some of the greatest works of modern literature that are out there, and in the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. So I think it's a very tough pill to swallow while you're in it.
Yes.
It's tough to sit there and go, wow, I'm so grateful for this experience when you're really in the thick of it, right? There are people who are capable of doing that. In my faith tradition, many of them are called saints, who we have documented evidence of them going through tremendous suffering, and while they're going through it, literally thanking God for those experiences because of the sanctifying effect it has on them and others. And that's tremendous. I don't claim to be at that level. I think that is something that's aspirational, and absolutely it still is reflective of a truth that we, in our suffering, we are able to experience that solidarity with our fellow humans. We learn about ourselves and about existence itself. We can reprioritize our lives in ways that are truly meaningful and make them better. At the same time, if I could snap my fingers and bring my son back, my son died when he was 7 years old in a tragic accident. I would, and I think that's that's the tricky nature of these types of experiences. Do I think that, good has come after the fact? Yes, there's been tremendous good. We can look at suffering in so many different ways. One of the ways we can look at it is on the effect of our suffering on other people around us. So even if it doesn't give us necessarily the opportunity to become better, when we are suffering, the people around us have the opportunity to become better people. It opens up the door for them to enter into our lives and to do all the things that they that they do to assist us. And I think that that's a really powerful thing to recognize. Again, it's I don't want to diminish the truly gut-wrenching nature of these types of things on our brains and on our bodies, the physical nature even of grief. At the same time, I think, if I would agree with Stephen Colbert and his assessment that if we're to look at life and be grateful for any of it, we should be grateful for all of it. And I am tremendously grateful for the 7 years, 9 months, and 30 days that we had my son Vincent before he died. And do I still think about him every day and miss him terribly? Of course I do. I have a much richer and more complex, and I think in many ways improved way of viewing the world now than I did then. So I think it's complicated, it's tricky, but the crucibles that we face in life, they are opportunities for us. They are trials that we can face with some fortitude, and they teach us a lot. So my short answer, that's a long answer to the question. Are crucibles gifts? My short answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. My dad has this saying that he has said pretty much our whole life, but has become more interesting to me in the last 10 years. And it says that he always says that we're going to wrestle a blessing out of this. And I just find that such an interesting way to think about it. I think about that a lot because it is wrestling with ourselves and with sadness and with challenge, and yet there is a blessing to be wrestled out of it. And so I always think of that statement when I'm thinking about these things, because it's really both. And I think that's the other piece of this, is that I have learned that we walk through life, it's kind of like a balance beam. It's like it's both and that takes a long time to sort of get comfortable in that space, because we live in more of a binary world of sorts. And that is just a bit uncomfortable. But I think we can get there. But like you said, it's in no way to diminish the excruciating pain of life, because we're human.
Right. And I really like that phrase, wrestling a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot better than making lemonade out of lemons or something, right? Because that's trite and cliched and minimizes the tough nature of this. Now, I was a wrestler in high school, and it is the toughest sport you can possibly imagine. I saw a clip recently where somebody was talking about how you ask anybody who played sports what the hardest sport is, and if they haven't wrestled, they will say a variety of sports. Mm-hmm. If they have wrestled, they will say it's wrestling. It's the most exhausting, most potentially humiliating, tough experience that you can go through. And I think it's appropriate to think about the idea of wrestling a blessing out of something. It's a struggle, and that's a big part of it. So I like that phrase a lot.
Yeah. So you're a social scientist and a practicing Catholic, and you mentioned your faith before. And, I'm curious about how you see like a synergy between social science and ancient wisdom, philosophy, theology. So if you could start there of telling us like what synergy you see. And then secondarily, I'm curious, like, how is that especially relevant to us today in our culture?
The way that I look at that is, in terms of my lens as a social scientist, as an organizational psychologist, looking at human organizations and the process of how humans organize, period, is that I see so much intricacy and beauty in that whole process. And it just makes me go, wow. And I think there's something amazing about how we do the things we do as humans. I think there's an incredible power that we have from social science in terms of trying to understand and explain and predict certain types of aspects of human behavior. At the same time, I don't think those types of questions and answers are the only types of questions and answers that matter. I think there's a whole nother set of questions and answers around what it means to live a good life and what being human is all about, that comes to us through millennia of thought, right? And going back to the Greek philosophers, moving on through the theologians of the early church in my tradition, and to the present day, that we can really start to understand a bit more about human behavior, as well as just the wonder of human existence. So there, I see an elegant synergy there. I don't see contradictions between science and what we might consider faith, or the faith and reason type of debate, quote unquote, which I don't really see there being one. It's a bit of a straw man when people come at people of faith and say that there's no reason involved there, or no analytical thought allowed, because there's a well-known Catholic bishop named Bishop Robert Baran, and he talked, no relation, different spelling of the last name, but he talks about it in terms of, we don't have just this, rickety, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, some rickety little sailboat of an intellectual tradition when it comes to matters of faith. In fact, it's an intellectual ocean liner that goes back centuries. And that's something that we disregard at our own risk. And so I think there's tremendous insight and utility to be found in looking at things through both lenses in an integrated way. And that's what I try to do. When I think about, sometimes people ask me, for example, what if, maybe this will come up in our chat today, but what have you learned from your experiences and so forth? And that's an interesting question. And I have some answers. At the same time, my experience doesn't actually matter that much in terms of providing generalizable knowledge for the rest of the population, because we can actually look at a whole bunch of different experiences. We can look at how people respond to grief and stress and coping and all these different things from the science of it. And that helps us know a lot as well, right? And so when I think of what it takes to make more evidence-based conclusions about things, part of that evidence, comes from scientific research, which, a single story, including my own, does not rise to meet that evidentiary threshold of what counts as evidence. It's a story. It's a piece of evidence. It's my experience. Sure. At the same time, it's more important to look across all the different types of those types of experiences, those types of human phenomena, and see what is truly bearing out. The other type of evidence that we have is, professional expertise and people that ask these questions and have thought for many centuries about the meaning of life and how to be a good human. And those things really matter too. And so I see it kind of as these two pillars of evidence that can help inform how we face our crucibles, how we deal with suffering, how we make sense of the world, how we have better relationships with each other, and overall create the society that we would want to live in, that we would want to leave to our children.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that sort of, there's the personal story, and then there's the age-old theory, practice, understanding. What do you think about this idea that, they're both equally important? I know you're a scientist, a social scientist, but I have found in my own experience that by hearing other people's stories, it kind of gives me the sense like if they can do it, I can do it. Like they're to the other side. And so I think they're both important because when we are going through crucibles or facing hard things or facing things in, let's just say, even in the workplace from a leadership perspective or whatever we're doing in that way, it's like we need that theory, we need that long line of tradition, we need to understand all of those very important things, but we also need the person on the other side of the desk that gives us that personal experience, that personalizes that says, hey, okay, I can do this, I'm going to keep going. And so I think they're both so equally important. What do you think about that?
Yes. And so the way I think about that is, for example, the science would suggest that we can deal with the uncertainty in our environments, be it a crucible, be it some other form of unexpected stuff that we deal with. One way we can deal with that is through learning vicariously through the experiences of others, right? So there's the science piece. Now, what that actually looks like for you, oftentimes can be listening to and hearing from other people, and there's also just something human about connecting with somebody who has been through something that's somehow maybe relevant or relatable to your own experiences, and seeing that they're doing okay and came out the other side. And that helps you press that I believe button when it's really hard to do. There are those moments when we just can, I don't want to say lose hope, but it just seems so far out of reach for us to get somewhere more positive. But if we have the faith that other people have done it, that is helpful. One story that I think always comes to mind with regard to kind of vicarious learning and vicarious strength, that I always think about is when I was, this was about, it's 2024 now. This was good 11 years ago, actually 12 years ago, when I first learned that I was getting deployed to Afghanistan for a year. And, my wife was pregnant with our third child. And it was, that's a lot to swallow, right? And it was a whole year that I was going to be gone.
Wow.
I anticipated that I'd probably get to come back for 2 weeks in the middle of that, which I did. But it was a year, and it was in a war zone. And, the one way that my wife and I coped with that is through the recognition that we were not alone. Thousands upon thousands of people do this and have done this in terms of separation for that period of time, dealing with childbirth while the spouse is gone, all that kind of stuff, and they had made it okay, and that gives some strength to us, right? And so that's where I think that the science would say that yes, telling these stories is helpful because it helps people connect with something that maybe gives them some of that vicarious strength. And so that's how I see those things coming together.
So what you just said made me think of something that I think of often, and it's actually a realization that I came to when my son was really sick, and then after he passed. It's so easy to personalize our own challenge and make it think that we're the only one that this happens to. And when you're in the middle of it, I'm not saying that you're going to be able to have this perspective because none of us do. But when I had a little distance from it, I thought to myself, women all over this world bury children every day. It's a miracle that somebody's born healthy. I am not the only person who has sat in a hospital with their child for a year. People do it, unfortunately, like more than any of us want to know that they do. And so I've kind of come to this place where it's like, it's that individual experience and it is so powerful. But I realize that I'm not the only one. And that kind of gives me some strength for personally. It makes me feel like I'm part of this bigger story that is part of the human experience. How do you think about that?
A few things. So first of all, the realization that, child and infant mortality is a very real thing. That's true. So my son is buried in the cemetery that's behind my house.
Mm.
So it's literally behind my house. I could, if
Wow.
I teed up a golf ball somewhere in my backyard and got a really good whack at it, I could probably hit our, the monument by his grave. It's about
Wow.
300 yards from my backyard. And, so I've spent a lot of time walking through that cemetery. And what I noticed, and I'd never noticed before, but I really started to notice when I paid attention, were the number of children buried in that
Hmm.
that cemetery. Now, most of them are from some time ago, but there's one that says it's like a family plot, and it has like the big stone with the last name on it, and has the some, it looks like adults that are buried there, and then one of them just says the 3 infant children of
Wow.
the person, right?
Wow.
Or there's another one. There's a large monument, actually even closer to my backyard, that I think it's something like 6 children of this one particular person are buried there. And so, and even thinking about historical characters, I think I knew this way back when, but the realization of it kind of hit me, and I revisited the story of the fact that Abraham Lincoln, he had a son die while he was in office. I think it was typhoid fever. I think he was maybe 10 years old. And this is a person who was going through leading the Union forces through the Civil War, and he was deeply affected by it. And so the idea that the biggest lie, or a big lie, of suffering is that we are alone in it, and that we're the only person to have experienced this type of tragedy or anything like that. Now, of course, it is our story. It's something that's very personal for all of us. But if we go through our existence thinking that, we just kind of spiral down that path of thinking that we are terminally unique. That's actually a phrase that comes
like
from,
that.
I think it comes from the Alcoholics Anonymous folks, right? So, this idea that that you are so special in your own way that how could you possibly act differently or be differently? And so I think we have to break out of that. And that's one thing that I think, these types of stories do help with, is overcoming that idea of terminal uniqueness, and helping us to understand that, yeah, this is really hard and it's terrible. And, I may absolutely hate what you're going through because I have a little bit of an idea of what it's kind of like. At the same time, I tell people, trust me, you are far more resilient than you can ever possibly imagine. And I think that can be a real source of strength for all of us.
I agree 100%. I want to talk a little bit about leadership, because you mentioned resilience. And I think
Sure.
it's a really topic I'm very interested and curious about, especially today in our world. And I think when we look at leadership, I think oftentimes, at least, people see it as a means to an end. Like, in order to get to this role, I need to become a quote unquote leader. In order to get to this pay, I need to become a quote unquote leader. But the position doesn't make you a leader. The title doesn't make you a leader. The pay doesn't make you a leader. It's something to be cultivated. And as a person that works with leaders, I'm wondering if you can share with us what trends you're seeing today in leadership, and equally, what are some of the biggest challenges that our people are having in becoming good leaders?
Well, I think you mentioned one of the biggest challenges, which is seeing leadership in the wrong way,
Mm.
as seeing leadership as something that is necessarily tied to a position of authority, and that it's a means to an end, that it's a way to get paid more. I think the best leaders are the ones who approach leadership from a sense of values and character, and are doing things not for their own benefit. Now, are there not narcissists who can, bluff their way to the top of organizations? Absolutely. That happens all the time. And yet, I would say that's not the kind of world we want to live in. And so, I'd say some of the trends that I'm seeing in terms of leadership, first of all, there's very very little training given. And this is
Mm.
not really a new trend, but oftentimes what happens is that someone's a really good salesperson, so they get promoted to be the sales manager, and those are completely different skill sets, and it doesn't work out so well. And so those types of things happen, and those people oftentimes end up derailing in their roles. I'd say some of the biggest challenges are helping people to be selfless in their leadership, and also to be patient. I come across a lot of people. So I teach at the MBA level frequently. That's almost all my classes are either MBA students, or we have a master's in HR program I teach in. So those two levels. And sometimes I'll come across people who are early in their careers and think that they should be farther along than they are, and are very much interested in advancing quickly. And I think that's that can lead you. It's great to be ambitious, but it also can lead you astray if it starts causing you to do things that are contrary to your values, or are not in the best interest of the people around you. I think it's better to play the long game and do the right thing, even if no one's looking. At some point, someone will notice, and to really hone what you stand for as a person. Another challenge that I see leaders having, and this is unfortunately something I see not uncommonly at the senior levels, are folks who get to a point in their organizations and in their careers in which there are fewer, I'd say, rules for how they should act, right? So when you're more junior in an organization, it's kind of like do this, do that. As you become more senior, there's not as much of a playbook. Mm-hmm. And when there isn't a playbook, then decision making can become really paralyzing for some folks, because especially if you haven't developed a sense of what's right and what's wrong, and using those types of good values to guide yourself in those times of ambiguity and uncertainty. So it's a crucible of a different sort that those folks face, and they find themselves in a position where they've been handed a bill that they cannot pay because they don't have the requisite character and integrity to deal with it, and that's super problematic.
Hey there, it's Jess, and we're taking a brief pause to highlight this show's sponsor, the Heartstrong Collective. It's more than just a nonprofit. It's a social movement I founded to inspire people worldwide to embody resilience and grow through challenges. Through the Heartstrong Collective, we're dedicated to empowering caregiving families, investing in the next generation, and leaving the world just a little bit better than we found it. So you interface with a lot of different leaders, and I've been thinking a lot about courageous leadership. Like, how do we have more courageous leaders in our world? How do I develop my kids to be courageous leaders? How am I a courageous leader? I think that's just something I think about a lot. I have 2 boys that will be leaders in this world in some capacity. I'm wondering how you think we develop courageous leadership in our world, in our families, or just even in businesses. Like, what are some of those characteristics, and how can we do that individually, like in a micro sense in our own lives, but then also within the places that we're influential?
I think when it comes to being courageous as a leader, that has to come from a deep sense of purpose and meaning. And you have to be very clear. If you're going to make courageous decisions, that means you're making decisions that probably people don't like, or at least some people don't like, that are hard. You are, in a way, being a social deviant in those situations. And to do that, and to do it effectively, it certainly comes back to having strong values, knowing what you stand for, knowing the kinds of things that you're willing to get fired over, or the types of things that you're willing to resign over. That's really important. You have to be crystal clear on your non-negotiables, and having that clarity can allow you to operate from a position of real strength, because then you know what you stand for and what you don't. So I think that's certainly key. Now, character development for children, gosh, there's a lot going on there. I think part of it is being an excellent role model, helping your children to understand how you think about different decisions you're making, showing them what that looks like. It also involves, I think, exposing them to a variety of different scenarios and types of stories that help to communicate doing the right thing even when it's hard. The whole idea of kind of learning from the great stories of the Western tradition. There's a ton that we can imbue upon our children and help them to kind of have those reference points for when they find themselves in difficult situations. I also think that you can reward good behavior, obviously, when you see someone making a tough decision, or you can talk about it with your children and with others. So I think courageous leadership is something that's it certainly is necessary. I think that it's hard when you have folks who perhaps don't have the requisite character development or the values base to do it, because it really starts with all of that. And if you're playing catch up with that later in life, you've probably got some work to do. I think those are just kind of my first thoughts on courageous leadership. There's also just kind of the willingness, as I mentioned before, to put yourself out there and do things that are unpopular because it's right.
And that's harder to do today than ever in the culture that we live in, I think.
Perhaps. I mean, I think it's always been hard.
Yeah.
It's always hard to be a social deviant for the right reasons. But perhaps, there are certain ways in which today is harder than before. I don't really know. I don't know what the evidence would look like on that. But if anything else, what is tricky is, especially with the way that social media is designed, for example, we get the impression that we can very easily get sucked into our own echo chambers of certain people thinking in certain ways versus people who think in different ways. And that probably isn't the most helpful thing to develop independent thought.
That's a good point. When you were kind of first started talking about leadership, you talked a lot about values and knowing what you stand for and what you believe. And my personal belief is that leadership starts with self-leadership. Leadership of others starts with leadership of self. And, I think that it's hard to lead in our world, even in our families, just to be real practical for people listening, if we really haven't let ourselves and really have to understand, what do I believe in? What are my non-negotiables? What do I stand for? What am I going to do when this happens or when that happens? And to really clarify our values. For me and my husband, I think that that's one of the gifts of grief that has done that for us, is it's made things real clear about what's important to us. And I think that's perhaps one of the places where these crucibles intersect with our lives and give us a gift. Do you see organizations or people that you work with encouraging sort of that self-leadership, that self-awareness, in order to be able to, again, turn around and launch that into leading others?
If they let me talk to them, then they encourage that, because I agree with you. And actually, my business partner and I, we have a leadership development program. It's called Good Leaders Do This, and Good Leaders Do This has 3 different areas of focus: lead yourself, lead others, and drive results. So some of the things within leading yourself are things like character development, developing a sense of values, regulating your own emotions and understanding how your brain works to some degree, so that you can kind of manage your own mind. Those types of things are very important, and getting your own house in order is very helpful for then when you're trying to interact with the world around you and influence other people. Having all that sorted out on your own is very important. And so I'm in enthusiastic agreement with you on the idea of self-leadership and those types of things as a prerequisite of sorts for leading others and getting things done.
Yeah. So when I was looking up some different trends in leadership for this podcast, obviously we're in a political season, which we're not going to dive into, but the trend is that people in general don't trust their leaders. They're not trusting their government. They don't trust their leaders at work. And so I'm just wondering what you have to say about that as you observe the world around us, and as we are in this place where we're about to elect a new leader. Again, not to get down to that rabbit hole, but we are, and people are struggling to feel confident in the leadership, maybe even in their own business, and in their own company. They don't, I struggle with people leading in healthcare because I'm a healthcare user all the time, and I think that's a mess. Where is our sense of agency as the people that are being led by these large entities that we really can't control in a sense? And again, it goes back to self-leadership, but we do want to have an impact. Like, some of us want to contribute and to make the world a better place, yet we're in this environment of like distrust of leadership. Can you make any links there? Do you have any reflections on that?
So I have a whole bunch of different thoughts about that. I'm not sure if they're all pulled together in a coherent way yet, but what I can say and what I think is important is that our institutions really do matter, and that when we don't trust leaders, bad things happen, and we start to lose faith in each other, and that's problematic if we're going to work together and live together in a society that we want to be a part of. And one thing I'm wondering is whether or not people's mistrust of leaders comes in part due to their own bad experiences with leaders in their own workplaces. If that translates over to a mistrust of leaders writ large, and that might be the case. If nothing else, I think that all of us can do our part within our own spheres of influence to be the change that we would want to see. And that comes by being a good leader if you have the opportunity to do that. It comes through getting involved in different ways in your community, through either nonprofits or through your own workplace, to influence that whole dynamic. And what I can say from a kind of a U.S. centric way is I would also just encourage people to reacquaint themselves with the U.S. Constitution. I just want to put a plea out there for that. One of the purposes of the Constitution of the United States is to promote unity, and it does so in a rather ingenious way of deliberately pitting different parts of the system against each other. It makes for a grind, a slow process, but it is one that brings us together by function and necessity. That is a feature, not a bug of our system. And I've put my hand in the air 6 times now, if you include my original commissioning, and sworn to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Not asking everyone else to do that, but I do think it is important for us all to know and respect it, and have some idea of what's going on there. It's not that long. If you can find it online. You can buy a $2 little pocket Constitution and you can read it. And it really, I think, is at least something that we have here in this amazing country, that was designed to bring us together, and I think can do so again. So that's what I'll say about that whole piece. So know the Constitution, as well as be the type of leader that you would want to have, that restores trust and faith in our organizations and in our institutions, and celebrate and promote the people who also do that. That is a way in which we can collectively encourage the type of leaders that we need.
That's a great point. And I want to give a plug for the Constitution. I actually bought my boys one for Christmas the other year. And I said, you need to understand this, and you need to know that this is a blessing that you're in this country. And what does it mean? And as you grow up, you need to know, you need to understand it. And so I don't know. I actually saw there was I don't know if you know who Jack Carr is. He's like an author and a former Navy SEAL, but he did that for his kids. And that's actually where I got the idea. He got him a Bible and a Constitution when he left the Navy. And, I did those 2 things for my boys. I'm like, these are 2 things to understand and defend. So I think as parents, we also have
not a bad place to start, Jess.
Yeah. As parents, I think we have the opportunity to build these courageous leaders like under our own roofs by the way that we raise our kids and the way we talk to them about the world in which we live and the political climate in which we have. And I think that I just want to give a plug to parents out there because it's crazy out there, but we have the ability to do that, I think, in our own home. So today is September 11th, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring that up and ask you to share possibly a little bit of a reflection on it. You have given so much of your life to service to this country. And for those of us who are old enough to remember, we remember right where we were that day. You know, the amazing thing that came after that was the people that we became on September 12th, which I was thinking about that this morning in light of the world that we're living in. But you shared a Substack today about this tremendous story called Boat Lift. It was based on a 12-minute video on YouTube, which I highly encourage everyone to look up, which I did today and was so inspired. And I'm wondering if you would just share with us a little bit of your reflection on this day and why it's an important day for all Americans to remember.
Sure. It's interesting. I was thinking about this morning. I think September 11th, and it's not that unlike November 7th, which is when my son died. Like I get this, it's an emotional day. Like when I think back now, it's been 23 years since that Tuesday in September of 2001. I was a senior in college at that time, and I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was in the Navy ROTC program at Villanova University. They were paying for my education, and with the deal being that when you are done, when you graduate, then you are commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Navy or the United States Marine Corps, and you serve after that on active duty. And starting my senior year, and on that Tuesday, I remember checking the news just kind of in passing on. I think I just went online somewhere. I was in the university library and I was about ready to go somewhere else, and I checked it and I saw something about a plane hitting one of the towers, and I thought that's kind of strange. Then I went actually over to where our Navy ROTC building was, and everybody was crowded around the TV, and I stood there for the next hour or so, just in stunned silence as we saw the second plane hit on live TV, as both towers crumbled. We hypothesized among ourselves about how many people may have died, thinking, this might have been the bloodiest day on American soil since the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War. It turned out not to be, but it obviously was still horrific. And then there was just the growing realization that we had in that moment that, looking to the left, right and left of us at each other, knowing that, hey, in 8 months, we're going to get commissioned and we're going to go off and join the active duty components of our respective services. And we're going to be doing so not in a time of peace anymore. Mm-hmm. We're going to be going to war. And that's a heavy thing, right? To be thinking about when I was about, I wasn't even 21 years old at that point. I turned 21 a few weeks later. And I remember going to a class later in the day, and actually it was a class that my wife was in. So we met in college, and we were both in this class together at that point. So she was just my girlfriend at that point. we got married a couple years later. But we were in this class, and so we all wear our uniforms on Tuesdays. That's how I always remember as a Tuesday. And I remember one of our professors just looking at me, and I think there was one or two other people in uniform in the class, and she just said, I remember Vietnam, and thinking about all of us and what we were up against. And so it's and then just the way in which that event changed the trajectory of so many lives, including mine and the people around me who served. I never in a million years would have guessed that I would have been, I guess just 3 years after 9/11, less than 3 years, I was, doing maritime security operations off the coast of Iraq on a ship. As a reservist later on, getting called up to go to Afghanistan for a year to be an advisor to the Afghan National Police. Never in a million years would have guessed that would have been something I would have been doing. And so I just remember how that was going to change and has changed the trajectory of my life and all the people who served in that time. And, today being September 11th, as I've done on a number of other September 11ths, I have two children who are in a Catholic school, and I went over to their school because they have mass on Wednesdays, and they have a they call it the Peace and Patriotism Day for September 11th, and they ask anybody who is in the military or a first responder to be there in uniform. So I was there actually today doing that. Important that we remember it. And as you mentioned, remembering September 12th is just incredible. I remember, and I encourage, this is another YouTube video that people should go out there and check. They should, love him or hate him, you should go out there and watch the video of President George W. Bush throwing out the first pitch at a Yankee game a few days after 9/11. It's an incredible story. It's tremendous. And, the unity that we had in our country at that moment, that's something that I think we can aspire toward. I hope that, we can do that without some sort of, tragedy that binds people together. The other thing that I shared on my Substack, which, folks can check out, and as you mentioned, is the story of the boat lift that occurred actually on 9/11. So, when the towers fell, what hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers realize is that Manhattan actually is an island. And if you were, in the financial district there and you were going south, because north was ground zero, to the west, east, and south, you're going to run into the water. There are, rivers on three sides of Manhattan and the bay to the south. And some various boats started taking people off. And over time, the Coast Guard realized that this was going to be a real problem. And so they put a call out on the radio that all available boats should report to Governor's Island, which is a island about half a mile off the edge of the lower edge of Manhattan. And what you'll see in the film is, just the amazing self-organizing, selfless effort of hundreds of boat drivers and their crews streaming in towards New York City, evacuating people who thought we were still under attack. And not only they thought that we were still under attack, the boat drivers too, thought, hey, here we are. We're one of the captains in the video. He was one of the guys he was driving the Staten Island ferry. And if you're not familiar with the Staten Island ferry, it's a big orange thing. Mm-hmm. And people are like, he said, here I am, this big orange target, but we're going to keep doing this. And they did it for about 9 hours. They evacuated nearly 500,000 people from lower Manhattan. And, it's the largest waterborne evacuation in the history of the world. Up until that point, the largest such evacuation was the evacuation of Dunkirk in World War II, in which 339,000 soldiers were evacuated from that northern coast of France over the course of 9 days. And this was, 500,000 people in less than 9 hours. And it's an incredible story. And it makes me think about, what would I do in those situations? I think having that sensitivity toward action and vigilance towards what you could possibly do in those types of situations is really a first step to actually doing it, right? When we think about our thoughts and our planned behavior and our actions, it predisposes us toward doing something. And, regardless of, what happens in our lives, we will undoubtedly face those situations where we will have an opportunity to positively influence some situation. It probably won't be driving a boat to rescue people from Manhattan, but it very well could be rendering first aid. It very well could be calling for help. It very well could be simply being there with another suffering person. And this is something that, going back to some of the other things that I read and think about a lot, goes back to a letter that Pope St. John Paul II, who was leader of the Catholic Church from 1978 through 2000 until his death in 2005. He wrote a letter in the early 80s, and it was actually just a couple years after he was almost killed by an assassin. And he wrote this letter in which he talks about the meaning of human suffering. And one of the things he says in that letter is he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and how, the parable of the Good Samaritan, for listeners who may not be super aware, it's, the idea that there was a guy who was in need on the side of the road, bunch of people go by, they don't help him. One of the people who goes by and ignores him happens to be a priest even. And then a Samaritan, someone who in that culture, in that context of that story, was someone who, wouldn't be expected to help this other person, stops and helps and pays for his room and leaves him with some money to be taken care of for a while. And what John Paul II emphasizes is that one of the key things that we should take away from that story is that we cannot be passersby. We have a duty to our fellow humans to stop and to sympathize and to act and to help each other. And I think that starts with the creative imagination of how might I help in these types of situations, and attuning our minds, be it to, help in an emergency situation, or simply having a watchful eye towards those people who need our assistance. I think that's a big part of this. And maybe that's something that we get from, the crucibles of life. Maybe it's something we get from, the grief and the tough things that you and I have been through. We get an increased sensitivity toward other people, and we know how to deal with them, and to help them in those situations. If nothing else, we can acknowledge the pain that they're going through. And one thing that suffering does for us, and this is another thing that I'm borrowing from John Paul II on, is it evokes in us the great question, why? There's the why and the why me. Kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier with this idea of, we can fall into the trap of terminal uniqueness and feel like it's something that's just happening to us. And maybe it kind of is, but it's that why is something that we all face. And when other people are going through pain and suffering, one thing that we can do is acknowledge it. There's a professor of religion. I think he died a few years ago, but his name's David Kane. And I came across an article he wrote, and he said, one of the best things we can do is simply acknowledge people's pain. And he says, and I quote, "A shared yes, that is how it is, may open a tiny crack and let a little air into the claustrophobia of suffering." And I just think that that's an amazing way to think about it, because suffering can be utterly claustrophobic.
It is isolating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
And to have that. So speaking of the Good Samaritan, you have organized an amazing day of service in honor of your son, Vincent. I got to share something with you. I thought this was cool. I as I was getting ready for this. So my grandfather, Joseph Vincent, was in the Navy, and he was a Navy corpsman in World War II. And I just thought that was cool because your son's name is Vincent. And I just think that sometimes life has these like coincidences, and today's 9/11. And I just thought that was cool. So I wanted to share that with you. But I want to know more about this day of service. And I want people to hear it from you in this sense, because it's coming up, first of all. But second of all, because I am really intent on helping people to see that they can make impact from their stories, that the challenges that we go through are calling, as we've talked about, and you're doing something. And so I would love people to learn about that from you.
So my son, as I alluded to earlier, he was 7 years, 9 months, and 30 days old on November 7th, 2020, when he was hit by a car while riding his bike on the sidewalk. He was out with my wife and our other 3 children, and a driver was not looking as looking at the sidewalk while exiting a parking lot, and hit him while going out into the road. And so in the aftermath of that, my wife and I independently had this idea of a day of service in his memory. And part of that is due to the fact that, if you haven't gathered yet, dear listeners, we are a little bit of a Catholic family. So we name our kids after people that have saint names associated with them. So St. Vincent de Paul was a priest who is known as the patron saint of charitable causes and of the poor. And he actually was really intent on helping to organize. And his thing was, hey, we need to help the poor. And a lot of people recognize that we need to do it in an organized way. And that was something that he was really passionate about. And we thought, wow, it would be really great if we could do something to help the poor and the vulnerable in Vincent's memory. And more importantly, to help people to see beyond their own bubbles, to interact in in-person service projects, with people who are not like them. I live in a pretty cozy little town here in Northeast Ohio. But if you go 10 miles away, you can end up in some areas down in Akron, or if you go a little bit farther north and go into Cleveland, that are tough, right? Most people in my town have no reason to go to those places. Mm-hmm. And yet there is tremendous suffering, tremendous need for service. So in 2021, we had our inaugural Vincent William Baran Day of Service, and brought out several hundred volunteers to do various service projects. We also had a large Friends of the Poor walk, which is actually a national thing that the Society of St. Vincent de Paul does to raise money for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, where they go and they directly help people all over the country. And so we brought a lot of people to that event, and we kept doing it. It's grown over the years. Last year, we had almost 700 people participate in in-person service projects in Northeast Ohio. And we also, as in prior years, brought people to the Friends of the Poor walk. And we're doing that again this year. And this year, we actually have things spread across about 8 days of events from September 21st through the 28th, culminating with that big community event of the Friends of the Poor walk on the 28th. So I encourage people to check it out if they're interested at mightyvincent.org. That's mightyvincent.org. If they want to learn a little bit more about what we're doing. It really has been a beautiful thing to watch people come together to serve each other and to get out there beyond their own comfort zones. It's easier, I would say, and still helpful, but it's easier to write a check, to donate money to something. It doesn't take time. You don't have to be uncomfortable doing it. At the same time, I think there's a lot of value in actually getting out there, seeing a homeless shelter, doing something in it to help. Even if it's just, we have other projects that are like, helping with the landscaping around something, or sorting books at the Cleveland Kids book bank, or things like that. All these different things also raises a lot of awareness for a whole bunch of different great nonprofits in my area. So it's a fantastic event. We have loved doing it. It's a lot of work, but it is great. I remember during that inaugural event, I think that was kind of like I had this realization, I think on the Saturday, the big day that we had that year, where I felt happy. And I was like, that's like the first time I had felt happy in, almost a year. And it lasted for a couple minutes. But it was amazing. And that has perpetuated to this day and is really, really a beautiful thing to see. And, and speaking of beauty, I've been on a bit of a beauty kick recently, looking at the research on beauty. And there's this whole idea of not just prettiness, right? We're not talking about physical attractiveness or anything like that. But there's, natural beauty and artistic beauty. And then this other idea of moral beauty. When we see selfless acts of charity, of forgiveness, of self-sacrifice, what it does to us is it can broaden our own imagination and our own kind of repertoire of available behaviors, things that we might do, and it can inspire us. It really is powerful. And I hope that people, through seeing all the moral beauty of what people do when they come together, it's not us. I mean, we go to a handful of projects. We certainly can't, we don't even see everybody because they're all over the place, right? We know they're happening. We're coordinating. We go to a few of them. We go to the ones that we can. But then we see the pictures to roll in, and it's really quite something. But I hope that serves as a point of inspiration for people, and inspires a little bit more behavior that is conducive with the type of world that we all want to live in.
That's really beautiful. The idea of being heartstrong, I always say that there's 4 questions that every person should ask themselves when they face a challenge. And it's, who do you want to become? What do you want to create? Where do you want to help? And how do you want to inspire? And so you certainly have a heartstrong story, and that's, to me what being heartstrong is in the world around us is taking our crucibles, taking our challenges and translating them into impact in the world around us. And, of all the things we've talked about, being a good leader and the country that we live in. And, I woke up this morning, last night was the debate. I don't know if you watched it. I did. And, think what you want. But I was like, the question I think we should be asking ourselves this morning as Americans individually is how do I be a good American? And I just thought came to me this morning, regardless if you liked the debate or didn't like it. It's like all that stuff is going to happen as it's going to happen. Just like our kids died and we can't control it, and we have other things that we can't control. But how do I live this life the best that I can? How can I make an impact? How can I contribute? How can I share what I'm learning? And I think that's what I'm distilling this conversation down to, is that's the question that each of us are asking ourselves, our families are asking ourselves, and that I encourage people listening to ask themselves too about their own lives, because that's what we have like control over today. And I think that's what we're called to as humans, as people of faith. But before we close out, I do want to ask you about your son, Dominic, because I think this is an important tie into all of this, because you have a new baby in your house and he's going through some challenges. And I've thought of your family a lot because, our son Bodie was born 2 years after Ethan died. And people have this concept of like a rainbow baby and everything's going to come and be great again. This, I don't know, there's this concept among mothers online. You might not know about that, and I remember thinking to myself after Bodie was born and we found out about his diagnosis, the question of why. It's like, hasn't there been enough? Haven't my kids been through enough? Haven't we been through enough? And why do we have to go through this whole thing again? And I'm still figuring that out. But I also believe, we're more compassionate and more loving and more resolved. And our kids, and it's just, there are gifts and it's really hard. And so I think you guys are on a similar journey, a little, not quite there yet, and they're going to be different. But I'm just wondering if you would be willing to share about Dominic and kind of this blessing and challenge that your family is facing, and how maybe, I know it's new, but you're thinking about that a little bit in the light of all the things that we've talked about.
So you're absolutely right that we have a new little guy in the house, and his name is Dominic Walter, and he was born on July 17th of this year. So this has been a very interesting year. And actually, we first started a conversation about possibly doing a podcast together months ago. And there have been kind of two interesting crucibles that got thrown at me that delayed our ability to schedule this. And the second one is Dominic. The first one, though, was I actually got news that I was getting promoted in the Navy. So this was back in late February. I found out that they're going to make me a rear admiral. And that's a fairly substantial crucible of a different sort, right? That be taking on a whole bunch more responsibility, and that it's certainly goes in the good news category professionally, but man, it's a lot, and it's humbling, and it's exciting and intimidating all at the same time. So I was dealing with all that, and about 3 weeks later, I was actually traveling for Navy related business, and I got a call from my wife where she had gone to her 20-week ultrasound, the anatomy scan ultrasound, where they check things out and whatnot, and there were a number of issues. One of which was myelomeningocele, which is a severe form of spina bifida, in which the spinal cord protrudes from the spinal column and kind of creates a fluid-filled sac, obviously creating various types of disruptions neurologically from that point of the back downward. And then there were a bunch of other things. They said we can't find a right kidney, and a host of other issues, right? And so then it became this cycle of like weekly ultrasounds, more medical ambiguity. My wife had 2 MRIs while she was pregnant, right? Which is not a very enjoyable thing. I got to sit there while she was trying to be still inside the MRI machine and taking pictures of the little guy, and still not a whole lot of clarity coming from that. Aside from the fact that they said, he's going to be born. You'll need to have spinal surgery right away. And so then I think I was good about the fact that I didn't hop right away on in terms of like Googling all the different symptoms and prognoses and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's necessarily a very productive thing to do. If you have good medical access to good medical professionals, use them. That's a good way to sort through that instead of trying to do your own research on it, because I don't know, I'm not that kind of doctor, right? I'm not a medical doctor. So so he was born. He came a little bit early, and had spinal surgery about less than 12 hours after he was born. That went, as expected. It's, they basically just close up the area. And then he had to sleep on his little tummy for like 5 days while that was healing up a little bit. And, the other things that we're watching for are whether or not his brain is going to swell to the point that he'll need a shunt and all these other types of issues. But like you, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, we've been through so much. And this is what other people were saying to us. They're like, man, this is not fair. You guys, like, you don't deserve this, like in an extra way, given that you've already been through a lot of things. Right. And so, dealing with that was challenging. And at the same time, I'm going through the process of, I write a lot, as you mentioned, and I try to think about this stuff. And I'm like, well, in consultant speak, this is time to eat my own dog food, right? This is time to practice what I preach here. And part of that is not sugarcoating your own experience in terms of what you're facing. You can't avoid this stuff, right? You have to, I think, stare it in the face. And while at the same time being open to the possibility that there's, unexpected joy in these types of circumstances, and certainly occasions for gratitude and so forth. And actually, just the other day, I came across another quote from a different pope. This was Pope Benedict XVI, and he has a whole letter he wrote about hope. And he said, "It is when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, when we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaninglessness and abandonment is all the greater." Right. And so this idea that we're going to deal with this as it comes, and we're going to make decisions based upon our values and what we think is right. If you believe that all life is meaningful, that this is a time to believe in that, right? And to put that into action. And so that's what we did. Now he, in what we consider a true answer to prayer, his kidney function is far better than anticipated. It seems that maybe his right kidney kind of migrated over to the left side and kind of became fused or something. Bottom line, he didn't need to have dialysis right away, which was the original possible concern. He was in the NICU and the step down unit there for almost 4 weeks. But we were anticipating like 2 to 4 months, because we were just, this is probably where we're just like, buckle up, here it comes. Right. And I think having those types of realistic expectations, while not falling into despair, right? If you can be realistic about it, that is helpful, because then if something's better, then that's a pleasant surprise. And brought him home. He also has a club foot, and they're in the process of fixing that, but that's, kind of secondary to his other stuff. But he's he's the cutest little guy ever. He's, I think he's doing pretty well, all things considered. He will most likely, be in a wheelchair for his whole life, and he'll have various other challenges and so forth. And there'll be a lot of things we'll be looking out for and whatnot. But he is a tremendous source of joy in our house, and just seeing what it does to my other children in terms of their response to him. And they're going to get to grow up with, I have so Vincent, if, when he died, he was 7. So, he would be a 6th grader if he were still alive. But I have a sophomore in high school, an 8th grader, and a 4th grader. But they're at the age where they're actually old enough to actually be helpful in terms of, providing some assistance with him and everything. And they're just incredibly sweet and amazing with little Dominic. It's given other people in our community the opportunity to help us in various ways too. It's another piece of this adventure that we're embarking upon. And, it's something that we're taking one step at a time, and with a whole lot of gratitude along the way.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I feel like we went through a lot of different topics here today, but at the end of the day, I think we're talking about living courageously, leading yourself, fighting through these challenges, figuring them out, asking questions, being curious about them, applying what we're learning to our lives as leaders and as parents, and also the choice to make an impact from your personal experience so that other people get to experience that as well. And I think that I've seen that in my life to be so powerful when we invite other people into it as well. And so I just want to thank you, Ben, for your time and your generosity of your time. And I just wish you and your family all the best.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation with you, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Becoming Heartstrong. I hope you found today's episode inspiring and applicable to your life. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Before I go, this is just a quick reminder that I believe in you, and I believe that you too have the ability to become heartstrong. I'll chat with you soon.